Thank you very much, Gemma. Hi, good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can all hear and see me. So look, as Gemma said, my name is Richard Tobias from Impart, and we specialise in helping organisations win tenders. So over the next 30 to 40 minutes, I'm going to be talking you through various hints and tips and insights into how you can actually go about improving your tender responses. More than happy to share the slide content with you. So if you happen to see anything on the screen that you feel is of interest, there's no need to write it down. In the unlikely event I say anything of interest, clearly feel free to write it down. But I can circulate via Gemma all of the slides for you following the session. Right, so I think before we sort of dive into the actual responding to tenders piece, I thought it would be useful just to really reiterate how important it is to be selective when you're actually deciding whether to pursue opportunities or not. We know different organisations take different approaches to qualifications of bids, but fundamentally we would always recommend that an organisation should be asking themselves three key questions. Firstly, can you actually do it? So can you do what the customer is looking for? Can you be compliant? Secondly, can you actually win it? So is there anything about you that's going to set you apart from other organisations, whether that's through the quality of your service, the quality of the tender response, your pricing, are the people within the customer that actually want you to win? And then finally, is it worth winning? So that could be the size of the revenue, the profitability, it could be a particularly high profile or strategic opportunity. So we would really suggest that organisations ask themselves these three questions. And as a result of that, if the answer to all of those things is yes, then it's almost certainly going to be a good opportunity for them to pursue. So when I was deciding how to structure this session, I thought it would be very useful really to provide an insight to people in what are the things that actually cause evaluators most frustrations and what are the things that cause bidders to lose most marks. Because if there's a common understanding of that, what we can then do is spend the session talking about what can you do to minimize the likelihood of these things happening. So this is a frustrated and slightly depressed evaluator, but the key things that we often see and evaluators often see that cause a lot of irritation. Firstly, responses that are clearly written by different people. You're normally responding on behalf of an organisation or a collaborative or a consortium, but when you read the content, it's very evident it's been written by a whole host of different people. Could be different writing styles, structures, even different fonts. So it's really important that this is standardised. I know it might seem very obvious, but it's really important to answer the question that's been posed. Now, some questions are very straightforward, others are complex with multiple aspects to it. They are going to sit and compare your answers to the question, and it's amazing how often people or organisations don't fully answer the question that's being posed to them. It's one thing answering the question, but you also need to address the evaluation criteria. In public sector procurement, they're very clear about what you need to do to get a particular score. That needs to be borne in mind when you are writing your answers. You might answer the question, but if you don't fully address the criteria, you're going to be dropping marks. This is an incredibly important aspect of responding to tenders about the question format. Evaluators want to be able to go down the question, go down your answer, and just tick stuff off. So if you follow the structure of the question, you're making life very easy for them. If you haven't followed the structure, they have got to search your answer and try and work out where you are answering different aspects of the question. It is hugely frustrating, and it tends to be quite a strong motivator for them to mark people down. You often find that people writing the answers are more knowledgeable about the subject matter than the people evaluating them, because you are living and breathing your area of expertise on a daily basis. It's important to bear this in mind when you're writing your answers, to ensure you pitch it at an appropriate level to allow them to understand it. The factor response isn't nice to look at. Now, this can be down to the portal that's being used. It may just be pure text that can be inserted, so there's very little you can do about it. But when you have the ability to be using Word documents and the like, just little things like having your answers in a different colour to the question, having space between your paragraphs can make a massive difference on how appealing or unappealing it is to look at and to read. Tenders are ultimately selling documents. You are trying to persuade the evaluators and the customer why they should be picking you. So it's important to be bringing out and explaining what the benefits are of your options that you're offering and the solution you're providing. You can't leave it for them to infer it. Evaluators can only score what is written down in front of them. It's also important that the bid is focused on the right people. You should be focusing on how you can help the client and potentially other stakeholders like the public. It shouldn't be an inwardly looking document that's just talking about how good you think you are. And finally, I appreciate a really good starting point for a tender is a previous tender that you've done. It's important to recognize it's a starting point. Every tender is different, slightly different requirements, slightly different questions, slightly different limits on the amount of content. You have to customize and bespoke that content. You'll often find that's not done, so responses have irrelevant information or not enough information, or it might even have the wrong customer name in it. It has to be customized. So look, these are the main frustrations that evaluators see. These are the main things that cause bidders to lose marks. So what I thought would be useful in terms of an agenda then was to go through a number of techniques that can be used to try and address these sorts of issues. Now, firstly, just like to talk about selling. Now, if this was a workshop that we were face-to-face in, I'll try and do this in a more interactive manner, but clearly we are slightly constrained. But what is selling? I'm not looking for a dictionary definition, but I think my take on this is, firstly, selling is about positioning or articulating your product or service in a way that is most positive. So what I mean by that is you're highlighting the positives, the benefits, the things that set you apart from others. Let me be clear, I do not mean lying. Some organizations may choose to do this. Clearly we would never support or encourage that. You want to be truthful, but you want to be focusing on the positives. And it's also important to do it in a way that is relevant to the customer. So understanding their level of knowledge and expertise, trying to use their language, articulate it in a way that is actually going to resonate with them because they understand what you're saying. It's also the art of persuasion. It's persuading the customer that they need what it is that you have. Now, there is a difference between needs and wants. Needs tends to be more in a business, professional environment. Wants tend to be more in a consumer environment, the latest technology, high-profile brand, and so on. And then finally, a slightly more provocative definition, but certainly for some salespeople and some organizations, this is the case. It is the art of manipulation. It is manipulating your customer down a particular route to give you the best possible chance of being successful. So an absolutely vital part of selling, whether this is face-to-face or whether this is in the written word in a tender, is articulating the features and benefits of what you are offering. It's really important to understand the difference between these two things, because features ultimately are just a means to an end. Benefits are the reason that organizations and people buy things. So a feature is purely a distinctive attribute or aspect of the product or service that you're offering. The benefit, as I said, is the important part. The benefit is the advantage or the value that is going to be gained from that feature. Now, just to try and illustrate this and bring it to life, I'm just going to use an example of a pencil. Now, again, if we were able to be more interactive, I'd certainly welcome your input into this, but I will talk through it myself, and hopefully it will still be a useful exercise for you. So here we have a pencil, and this pencil has a number of features associated with it. And normally when we speak to people in the room, the things they would typically bring up are its color, the fact it's bright, the shape of the pencil, the fact it has a rubber on the end, its length, its construction, so what it's made from, and the fact that pencils are pretty inexpensive items. So what we would then do is look at each of these things in turn. We would look at what are the benefits or the corresponding benefits of each of these features. So what's good about the color? I think certainly in most business environments where carpets tend to be a fairly dull grey color, they're easy to see, they're easy to find, you're less likely to lose it. In terms of the shape, I think the shape offers a couple of benefits. Firstly, I think the one most people will get is the fact it makes it more comfortable and easier to hold, but also it makes it less likely to roll off the table. And you will find in some sectors and some industries, for example, work that's carried out on boats and at sea, for example, you can find that pencils can be square, making it even less likely that they will roll. The rubber, clearly it's there to rub things out, but if we do take a bit of a leap here and actually try and use some business language, I would suggest the fact that there's a rubber attached to the pencil at the end, there's a financial benefit because you don't need to buy separate pencils. There's also an efficiency and productivity benefit because if you do make a mistake, you don't need to go searching for a rubber. You literally just turn the pencil over and rub things out. In terms of the length, it's an appropriate size, so you can write many thousands of words with it. It's also a very nice length, which means it's comfortable to hold, it's balanced, and you can be very productive for a period of time. There obviously comes a point where it becomes a little bit too short, a bit uncomfortable, and at that point you'll be less productive, so you'll probably look to purchase or utilize a replacement pencil. In terms of its construction, if you ask most people what happens when you drop a pencil on the floor, they would acknowledge and agree at a superficial level, nothing happens. So you would try and position the pencil as being durable and hard to break. In reality, though, you might actually break the lead inside. So whenever you sharpen it, the lead drops out. That may be an example of something you may choose not to highlight to the customer. You may focus on the fact that the exterior is very durable and hard to break. And then finally, these types of pencils are very inexpensive, minimizing your pencil budget. So what we've done is we've looked at a very basic item of pencil. We've identified various features associated with it and then the corresponding benefits. Now, the pencil market, like your industry, is hugely competitive. So I'm just going to talk about differentiation and setting yourself apart from other organizations. So I've just brought on screen a different pencil, a very snazzy looking pencil. Now, in some ways it's better than the last one, in some ways it's worse, and in some ways it's broadly similar. And we can identify that just through using a basics of RAG status. So I would suggest that the color's pretty rubbish. If you drop it in a corporate environment, it will be quite difficult to find on the floor. And also it's more expensive than the previous pencil we looked at. But I would suggest that the shape is better because it's got the clip on it, which means it's even less likely to roll. And if you have a jacket, you can maybe put it inside the pocket of that jacket. In the other areas, though, it's broadly similar. Now, this pencil has some additional features and therefore some additional benefits compared to the other pencil. So, for example, the grip. It means that you're more comfortable, you can probably work faster, and you can probably work for longer. So there are some efficiency and productivity benefits there. Also, it's refillable. So under the rubber at the end, you can put leads. And as a result of that, you don't need to buy pencil sharpeners. The pencil doesn't get shorter, so you're going to buy less pencils. But also that pencil is always that optimal length. It never gets to the point that it's less comfortable. So there are some financial benefits and some productivity and efficiency benefits as well. And finally, they've done some research and they've found that if you buy your staff nicer pencils, they tend to look after them better. So they're less likely to lose them, less likely to break them, again, reducing the frequency with which you need to buy pencils. So again, significantly slashing what I'm sure nowadays isn't a very big pencil budget. So look, what we've done then is we've looked at features and benefits. We've looked at how a different product can try and stand out from other products. The important lesson to take from this is if you were selling this pencil and if you were trying to sell it either face-to-face or in a tender, the things that you want to focus on are the features and benefits that set you apart from other organizations. So if you can persuade the customer that they want a refillable pencil, through explaining what the benefits are of it, they're never ever going to buy that previous pencil. Or if you could persuade them of that before the tender even happened, they may even change the specification so that other pencil would not even be included in the bid. Okay, so you can constrain your competition. What this does also emphasize, though, if you want to think about how you differentiate yourself from other products and other organizations, you need to understand who your competitors are. If you do not understand your competitor, you are just guessing as to whether you're differentiating yourself or not. Right, so that is the art of selling within bids, and I'd like to talk about the evaluation criteria and weighting. So this is something that certainly is part of every public sector bid they should be providing you with. Now, you don't need to read this slide, but quality evaluation criteria can vary massively from tender to tender. In some bids, it can be very detailed like this, and it can change on a question by question or even a section by section basis. We also see criteria that can be a bit vague and a bit woolly like this, and it can apply to an entire bid. Now, with this criteria, if you were to provide a very comprehensive answer to a question that addressed every aspect of the question and every aspect of their specification, the best score you could get is a 5. So the best you could get is 50% of the available marks. In this instance, the only way you can actually get a 7 or a 10 out of 10 is by adding value. As you can see, to get a 7, you need to provide some added value. To get a 10, you need to provide significant added value. That's fairly vague, and I would probably suggest that how the evaluators felt about you, so whether they liked you or not, would probably influence whether they gave you a 7 or a 10. It's always useful when a tender comes out to reflect on how you feel you are positioned and whether the evaluation criteria is therefore to your benefit or to your detriment. So what I mean by that, so if you're in a weak position, so by weak position, when the customer is doing their evaluation or doing their moderating process together, there is no one in the room that's going to be fighting for you to be the winner. In that situation, you want the evaluation criteria to be as detailed and prescriptive as possible, because to be blunt, it means it's more difficult for them to manipulate the outcome. Whereas if you're in a strong position, so there are people in the room that want you to win, you want that criteria to be as vague and woolly as possible, because it makes it easier for them to manipulate the outcome. So the criteria and how you're positioned, the two are very closely aligned, and so it's important to reflect on at the outset, do you think the criteria is to your benefit or to your detriment? Now, if you're in a weak position and the criteria is vague, that's not ideal. So what you may be able to use in that situation is the clarification process associated with the tender to ask questions to try and get them to tighten up that criteria. Because the tighter it is, the more defined it is, the more objective it is, and that could be to your benefit. Clearly, it's going to be very difficult to make evaluation criteria more vague. Now, in terms of the pricing criteria, we often find there's a lot of focus from organisations on the weighting. You know, is it 80-20? Is it 60-40? Is it 50-50? The weighting is, of course, important, but it's also really important to understand how the price score is calculated, okay? Because it can completely undermine potentially the weighting. Now, just to illustrate this, I can just sort of briefly talk you through the 3 most common scenarios that we see, and I'll talk from the most pleasant to the least pleasant. So firstly, it can be a basic ratio of the lowest price divided by your price. So if you're the cheapest, you get full marks. If you're double the price, you get half marks. If, in the highly unlikely event, you're 4 times the price, you still get a quarter of the marks. A slightly more aggressive version of that is a calculation which means, again, if you're the cheapest, you get full marks, but if you're double the price, you get no marks. So what that would typically mean, if you are 50% more expensive, you would still get half the marks. The most frightening scenario we've seen tends to occur when pricing is say only, for example, 20% of the weighting. But for every 1% more expensive you are than the cheapest, you lose 1% of that 20%. So if you're 20% more expensive, you get no price marks. So even though the weighting on price is not significant, you can lose your marks very, very quickly. It's also really useful and very important to understand how the weightings are allocated down to individual question, sections, and then between quality and price. There is no such thing as a perfect bid. Certainly the quality response can always be improved in some way. And if you're getting close to the deadline and you're trying to decide which answers you want to focus on, I would strongly suggest focusing on the answers that have the highest weightings. Because if you can squeeze one extra mark out of them when you apply the weighting, that can have a more material impact on your overall score. Now, if we look at this example, we have two bidders. Now, bidder 1 got 37 out of 50. Perfectly respectable score, some 3s, a number of 4s, and I think 1 5. And when you apply the weighting, that comes out at 70.8%. Bidder 2, however, did significantly worse. They got 27 out of 50 compared to the 37 out of 50. And as you can see, there's a large number of 1s, some 3s, a 4, and a couple of 5s. But because they did better on the questions that are worth more, when you apply the weighting, they actually win, even though the quality of their submission is significantly lower. Obviously, ideally, you want to do what you can to get maximum marks or as close to maximum across all answers. But it may well be if there are certain questions that have very, very high weightings associated with them, you might want to think about having a more robust review process associated with those. So, in terms of structure and language, I obviously mentioned earlier that this is a massive frustration for evaluators. So I just want to sort of reiterate at the outset that if you produce an answer that is really easy for them to read, it's well structured, very easy for them to evaluate and score versus the question, it uses language that they're familiar with, you will probably get a better mark than you deserve. Okay, so this doesn't even really consider any of the content that's in there yet. A lot of it is presentational. Also, if you can have an opening paragraph that provides some context, gets some of your key messages in it, and grabs the attention of the evaluator, they're going to be feeling emotionally far more positive going into the rest of the response. We need to acknowledge that questions vary massively. Some of them can be very short and very concise. Others can be long, complex, have multiple elements to them, various bullet points, and the like. And there are times that the evaluation criteria is asking for additional things. It could be they want to understand benefits, they might want to see evidence, they might be asking for added value or exceeding requirements. So all of these things together can make the requirement of planning your answer fairly complex. But it's really important to have a clear and consistent methodology for doing this. So there is a common approach to structuring your answers. So it'll make sure you cover every aspect of the question and the criteria and minimizes the risk of you dropping any marks. So the things that we would typically look for when we're looking at a question and trying to deconstruct it is, firstly, are there any obvious words or phrases in there that you could potentially use within your answer to signpost to the evaluator that you're now addressing this particular part of the question? You want to try and weave in their language. I know this might be hard to believe, but evaluating tenders can be really boring. So what evaluators may do from time to time is actually start skim reading. And if you think when they're skim reading, what are they looking for? It's going to be keywords and phrases from the question, from the evaluation criteria, or even from the specification. So if we can identify these and then make sure that they're woven into the answer, they're likely to come across them when they're skim reading. So as well as headings and key phrases, we need to consider the evaluation criteria. It is common to see things like exceeding requirements and added value. And we would suggest, instead of leaving it to the evaluators to reflect on and consider and decide whether you have exceeded their requirements, why not make it easy for them, as we've done with the rest of the answer? Include as a final subheading, exceeding requirements. Use their language. If they talk about added value, call it added value. But what you want to do is have a subheading in there where you're clearly articulating to them where you've gone above and beyond and what the benefits of that are. So I can just sort of give you sort of a minute or so. If you just want to read this question, I'll just sort of do a quick example for you. Okay, so if you look at this question and just ask yourself, firstly, what is it about? This question is about program and project risk management. But if we then go through the rest of it, we can identify certain words or phrases that would actually make it quite easy for the evaluator to see which bit of the question we're addressing. So, for example, identifying project risk and assessing the impact on the works. Approach to ensuring that works programs are accurate, and approach to working collaboratively with the client. So we're trying to use their language, but we're trying to draw out words and phrases that really clearly signpost where we are at in the answer. But also in here, there's loads of other words and phrases that we want to make sure that are within the answer. For example, so if you look at the first bullet, for example, the first subheading, you can't imagine you would answer that question without using the words time and price. So for some people, this is sufficient. Just by having it electronically using a bit of color, they can break it up. But other people's brains work slightly differently. So another way of doing this is through using some form of mind map. So in the middle, what is the question about? Around the outside, the identified subheadings. And as you would see, the first one being the opening paragraph, because we do think it's important to plan what you're going to say in those first 30 seconds to grab the attention of the person reading it. And then off each of these, the words and phrases that we would want to be weaving into our answer. So bear in mind, at this stage, no thought has been given to what the answer would actually be. All you've done is planned your structure and planned some of their words that you're going to incorporate within that response. Now, you can leave it to individuals to try and create these or deconstruct the answers themselves. It can be quite difficult and you want it to be done consistently. So we would actually recommend this is quite a good activity for someone within the bid team, bid manager, for example, to do. The way we actually do it, we actually include that deconstruction within a slightly broader document that we call an answer guidance template, where we're trying to capture in one place all of the key information to help the authors produce their draft answers. So the sorts of things we include in it: the question, as you'd expect, any word, page or character limits, the weighting, so they know what it's worth, the evaluation criteria, so they know how to get maximum marks, what's needed, who the agreed owner is, so if they dispute it, they can flag it very, very quickly to you. What the agreed win themes are. Now, the win themes, I would explain these by saying they are the 2 to 3 things that as a team you feel set you apart from other organizations and deliver real value and benefit to the customer or to other stakeholders. So if you imagine when things have eased somewhat, you actually get to go and see a customer or a prospect. If you're going to have a meeting with them, they meet you in reception and you're walking up to their office. It's a 40-second walk to their office. And they turn to you and say, why on earth should we pick you? The 2 or 3 things that you say in those 40 seconds are probably the things that you would want to be your win themes. As part of this document as well, there'll be the suggested structure, so the deconstruction, the words and phrases that you want to weave in so it's familiar, and some other hints and tips. So one I prepared earlier. So this is just an example template for you. So as you can see, the customer, the opportunity, this is the evaluation criteria. And as you'll see, to get maximum marks, you have to exceed some or all of their requirements. The win themes would be agreed at some form of kickoff meeting and captured in here. And then there are various hints and tips. Here's a quick read of those. Scrolling down, you can see question owner, question number, any limits on content, weighting, version control, and then the question itself. And this is the question I had on the screen. And then if you can scroll down, you can see how we do this. So the subheadings are in bold. The key phrases from the question we've put as sub-bullets that you can just delete once they've been woven into the main body of the content. And any other instructions we just put in italics. So a prompter to include your key messages and benefits. A reminder that they're asking how, in this one, how and when. And you'll see the last subheading is exceeding requirements. So we'd look for the question owners, the subject matter experts, to start populating this template with their answers under each of the subheadings. So hopefully you can see with these prompts, they're likely to have a far more compliant and good quality response. In terms of the process, obviously having a robust bid process is important, as is actually complying with it. We do have some clients that have a great process, but if no one's going to follow it, then it doesn't really help very much. We do sometimes speak with organisations where it can be quite a simplistic process, but the main concern with it is the focus is very much on getting something out the door by the deadline, as opposed to something high scoring and compelling out the door by the deadline. So this idea of sending out responsibility for questions, a number of weeks later getting the response, putting it into a single document, doing a bit of a spell check and submitting it, you can imagine there will be lots of contradictions, different language, different approach to structure and the like. That's not going to be a very good response. What we would strongly advocate and recommend is the sort of process I'm going to sort of talk you through briefly. And this thing really has three key phases to it. The first one is around planning and preparation. So at the beginning, get all sort of internal stakeholders, all subject matter experts in a room together or on a video call where you share information about the opportunity. So the background to it, discuss the customer's requirements, any concerns you may have about the requirements, any insights you have into the competition, into the stakeholders involved in making the decision, what your solution or service is likely to look like, and giving people a common understanding of the tender and what is required over the coming weeks and the milestones and the like. We would then agree who is responsible for what, even if answers require input from multiple people. We're very strong believers in having a single owner. They may need to work with other people, but you want to have a single owner. It reduces the risk of finger pointing and deadlines being missed. We would then share the templates that I showed you an example of with those individuals. And I think it's also important to recognize that for some bids, your offering may be off the shelf and fairly standard. For others, it may need to be developed. You need to work out what the program is, what your services are going to be, and the like. That takes time, and it may well be some of that work needs to be done before people can start putting pen to paper, as it were. The second phase is really all about producing and improving content. Most first drafts that we see are variable in quality. I think anything from all right to very poor. So it's important to go through an iterative process where every answer of every word of every answer is reviewed. It's edited so that there is consistency around the language. It's challenged. If the person reviewing it can improve it by adding additional content, it's great for them to do that. But often you'll find, because of the specialist nature of some of these things, it needs to go back to the subject matter expert. And if it can be done with comments and suggestions and guidance on how to improve it, they can then make further amendments. So there's an iterative process where you could be moving these answers from being 4 and 5 out of 10 up to 8, 9, and 10 out of 10 over a period of sort of 2 to 3 weeks. There does come a point, though, where the subject matter experts and even the people reviewing it can't see the wood for the trees anymore. You've seen the same content again and again. So what we then strongly recommend is having some form of internal peer review. So if you have 2 to 3 people within your organization who have a really good grasp of the subject, but haven't done any of the writing, actually get them to do a dummy evaluation and provide some challenge. Now, no matter how good I ever think a bid is, at the point we share it with the red team, we always get a huge amount of value out of this stage in the process, getting those fresh pair of expert eyes. There'll be further amendments required, and there may be further actions required by the original subject matter experts. Those things are done, and then the bid is submitted. But hopefully, as you can see, just by having this level of rigor and focus on quality as opposed to just hitting deadlines, the output is significantly improved. Then just talk really about resourcing. As I've just described, when we're talking about supporting the bid management function about managing people through the process is important, but equally and maybe more important is having the resources to review, edit, and challenge the content. So it's important to think about how this can be resourced. As you'd appreciate, most bids tend to go through peaks and troughs, so maybe preparation at the beginning to get everyone organised, first draft responses, second draft responses, peer review, and so on. But what you tend to find is most organisations, in terms of the resource they have to support this, have a fixed level of resource. And if that level of resource, is not sufficient to support the highest peaks in activity, you are compromising on quality and you are delaying things. Because at busy time, there is not sufficient capability and capacity to be doing a comprehensive job on all of the content. One way of addressing this is increasing the level of resource that you have in place to support those peaks. So that can certainly help address the quality aspect of it. What it means is there are long periods where they're not necessarily doing work because there's nothing for them to do. So it can be commercially fairly inefficient. The optimal way of doing it clearly is going to be aligning the resources available with the activity that needs to be undertaken. And as a business, we actually made a conscious decision to take this approach. So for example, we only charge clients for the work we undertake, and it may be a typical few days could be one day we spend 15 minutes sending 2 or 3 emails, the next day we're on 2 conference calls for 2 hours, and the next day we have 3 people reviewing 30,000 words. Okay, so you're scaling up and down the resource as required to ensure all of the activities are done in a timely manner and also in a high quality manner as well. So the final thing really, just before I summarise, is some sort of hints and tips to be taking away, and some of these reiterate some of the points I made earlier. It's so important you're focusing on the right people. You should be focusing on what you're going to be doing for the customer, for the public, and other stakeholders, not on how good you think you are. When you've written your draft answers, it's always very useful to just take a step back and reflect on how comprehensive is your response? Have you addressed who, when, what, why, where, how? If you have addressed all of these things, you can be very confident that what you have written is very, very thorough. If you haven't, you may want to think about making further edits to it. As I said, it's a selling document. You want to be highlighting the benefits you are going to be delivered, because that is the reason people and businesses buy things, because of the benefits. Evidence is also really important. If you're going to be making claims about how good you are, you need to substantiate it, or it just looks like very empty statements. Please also bear in mind, though, that you need to be evidencing both the experience you've had, so what you've done and where you've done it, but you also need to demonstrate that you're good at it. You may have done something for 30 years, but you may have been consistently really poor at it. So you need to show both aspects. And what you don't want is to submit a response, for them to accept it, for that to then form the basis of a contract, to then find there has been some misunderstanding or ambiguity. You want to be very clear about what you are providing and very clear about what you're not providing. So I would strongly recommend, if you want to make a commitment to do something, use the word will or shall. If you're using can, could, would, you may be talking about the fact you have a capability to do something but not offered it, but the customer may have interpreted it differently. So it's really important to be clear about what you will and won't do. When a customer gives you a limit on content, whether it's page, word, or character, that sets an expectation on the amount of detail they're looking for. So try and fully utilize the limit that they have given you. If they've given you a 1,000-word limit and you've written 200 words, it almost certainly means it is significantly lacking in detail. Spoke about boilerplate earlier. It's a starting point. It always has to be customized and bespoke for particular opportunities. You don't want to be in a position where there's irrelevant content taking up space, or you even make reference to the wrong customer. It's not always possible, but if you can just use color, imagery where allowed, space your content out, it makes it a far more pleasant experience for the evaluators. In terms of writing style, there is nothing wrong in reflecting the relationship you have with the client through the language you're using within the bid. There is nothing wrong in talking about we and you and our. That is absolutely fine. If there is a corporate policy you want to be more formal, then again, absolutely fine. Submissions are going to form part of a contract. You want to make sure they can be understood by people. So wherever possible, try and use simple, clear language. It's a major challenge in every sector, but try and minimize the use of jargon and acronyms. And when you do use them, make sure they're clearly defined. Ideally, you want to define acronyms the first time they're used in every question, but certainly as a minimum in every section. Also, you don't want to be waffling. You only have a certain amount of space, only a certain number of words that you can potentially use. So you need to be concise and to the point, because that means you're maximizing the quality of the information that you are providing within that constrained content. So look, just to wrap up then, I really just wanted to really emphasize that taking a very robust approach to these things has a massive, massive impact on organizations' success. It significantly improves the quality of content that's submitted and significantly improves the win rate and the return that organizations enjoy. If you look at the example that I have on screen, we recently worked, it was actually with an NHS trust, supporting them on a tender for a sexual health service. The question they had actually had in a tender elsewhere, exactly the same question, exactly the same word count, for basically exactly the same service. So their view was they would use the content they had submitted previously elsewhere. When going through the process and the challenge, that content changed. And what's on the screen, everything in red is basically an amendment from the original answer that they suggested we use. So as you can see, it came on massively and it improved massively. But then finally, in terms of success, I think it's sort of useful just to share some stats, KPIs and anecdotes with you. So certainly when we work with organizations using the sorts of process and governance and controls covered here, customers typically enjoy success rates of over 90%. They also enjoy 100% success rate getting onto framework contracts. In the last few months, we've been involved in a couple of bids where, from a quality perspective, the responses actually got scores of 99% and 100%. Rest assured, we did take the mickey out of the person who was the subject matter expert who dropped that 1%. Also, this support, whilst it may well be more resource intensive than you would sort of typically do on bids currently, as you're being more successful, you have an opportunity to be involved in larger opportunities, the returns are significant. Clearly, the returns are really a calculation between the value of the contract and the cost of our support. But as you can see, when you're getting up to these sorts of returns, the support or the additional costs in bidding are minuscule. And just sort of finally, an interesting anecdote, an organisation we've been working very closely with over the last 15 months. When we started working with them last April, their win rate was, over the previous 3 to 4 years, was consistently around 1 in 5. So they were winning about 20% of the bids that they've gone for. Since we've started working with them over the last 15 months, they have won 8 out of 9 bids. So their win rate has jumped up to 89%. As I'm sure you can appreciate, that's generated a huge amount of revenue and a huge amount of additional profit for them. Okay, thank you. I hope you've all found that useful. Any questions?
Hello, can you hear me, Richard?
Yes, I can hear you. Hello.
Hello. Thank you very much for your presentation. Fantastic. We haven't actually had any questions through at the moment. So if anyone does want to take this opportunity to ask Richard anything in particular, please do take a moment and put any comments or questions that you've got into the box at the side, into your chat box. We've been in discussion with Richard about potentially doing a more detailed workshop. Obviously, these webinars are great for passing on information, but we've been in discussion about potentially doing a bit more of a detailed workshop with a few more activities and things. So if anyone thinks that would be useful to them, please let us know. Drop us a line on the chat or drop me an email afterwards. That would be fantastic. But
yes, and I've got sort of a few ideas as well. I mean, one activity that we've done with organisations that they find hugely beneficial is actually getting people to do some dummy evaluations. So we've actually developed some answers and some bids to make specific points and to support people's learning. And actually getting people to evaluate tenders, it reinforces a lot of the things I've covered today. So how annoying it is if it doesn't follow the structure, how empty it can feel if you're making a claim but not substantiating it in any way. And you get to experience as well things like the moderating process, so you can see potentially how subjective some of these things can be. So there's maybe an opportunity to do something like that. Also, when I circulate when we circulate the slide deck, it does have my contact details on. I appreciate that some of you may have questions, but you may feel they're slightly commercially sensitive. In which case, if you do want to direct questions to me either by phone or an email directly, then feel free to do it.
That's great, Richard. I've just popped a question up that's just come through.
Okay. Yeah, so we tend to use the mind map approach initially to be building the structure. So we are absolutely strong believers the structure of the answer should be dictated by the structure of the question. And then the evaluation criteria, if it's asking for exceeding requirements, that would go on the end. So I think the first part of the mind mapping is building that structure. But yes, what you can then do is then expand on that and start thinking about, for each subheading, what are the features you would want to talk about? What are the benefits you would want to talk about? What evidence are you going to include to substantiate what you're saying? And also think about, are any of the win themes relevant to this answer or to this part of the answer? So you can use that mind mapping process to really start planning out your actual answer. We do quite a lot of training, and that's actually one of the next steps that we then go on to on the training, but clearly it's not viable to do it in this sort of format. So yes, it can be a very valuable thing. In terms of word counts, it's hard. I mean, it might seem very simplistic, but if there's a question with 4 parts to it and exceeding requirements, so you're effectively got 5 subheadings, and it's 1,000 words, the starting point may well be roughly 200 words per section, or you might want to say, 225 words per section, you're over, and then you can plan how you reduce it down a little bit. So yeah, there's various techniques to help you start building up your answer in a very structured way.
Okay, we've just got another question come through with regards to graphics.
So we are not graphic designers. I know some graphic designers. If you didn't have one internally or have one you would prefer to do yourselves, we're very capable at helping with tables and charts and organizational charts and things like that. So we can provide to a degree, but yes, certainly we're not the people that would make it into a beautiful glossy final submission if you wanted graphic designers.
Okay, we've got one come through here for you.
So on this, obviously we're not experts in what you do. So we actually work across a whole range of different sectors. So often when we're asked what our expertise is, I'll say our expertise is submitting high quality and compelling bids. We have to work very closely with our clients. So whilst we're not experts in what you do, so my background is I've sort of held various sort of sales and commercial roles in organizations. We are very good and very experienced and skilled at challenging commercial models. So asking the questions that underpin the assumptions you've made to cost it. And also by looking at the evaluation criteria, we can help sort of guide. You'll have a better feel for us as to how competitive you are, but we can certainly help guide and inform your price strategy based on how it's going to be scored. So there's certainly challenge and rigor we can provide, yes.
One more on SWOT assessments.
To be honest, it's if some people want to utilize that, that's fine. it's not necessarily something we do. We tend to, as I said, build the structure from the question and look at the evaluation criteria. We are then looking for the subject matter experts who should be experts in that particular field to be planning and thinking about what the content is they want to be putting into it. So that aspect, quite often we would look for the subject matter expert to do. We're then reviewing it to make sure that it's answering the question, adjusting the criteria, is compelling, bringing out benefits, evidence, and so on. So some of our clients will use it when they're planning their answers.
Okay, we've got one on covering letters.
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, there's covering letters, there's executive summaries. Sometimes people have an executive summary that they put in as a covering letter. The fact is, the vast majority of occasions, formally, they are not assessed. So it is for information. I think it's nice to provide a summary of what you're offering and to try and bring out the salient, most important points and explain what sets you apart from others. It needs to be bespoke, though. It needs to be very, very specific to the opportunity. What we often find is that covering letters and executive summaries are very generic. And therefore, when you read them, they can actually do more harm than good. So if it's done well, then it's certainly a good accompaniment.
Excellent. I think that's probably just answered Anne-Marie's question that just popped up with regards to executive summaries.
Yes. So the thing is, in some bids, they are very explicit about whether you can put in additional documents. If they make it clear you cannot include anything else, they almost certainly will not even open it. The procurement department will probably delete it so that the evaluation team don't even get to see it. So I think you're guided by the rules, but if there is flexibility to do it, it's worth doing, albeit it needs to be bespoke and meaningful.
Excellent. I think that is it for our questions. Thank you very much, and just within our time slot as well. Perfect timing, Richard. Thank you very much to everyone who's come along. I hope you found that useful and interesting today. And thank you hugely from Seeker, Yorkshire and Humberside to Richard and Impart for the webinar. I think it's been really interesting, hopefully really useful. As Richard said, he's happy to provide the slides. So I will get a copy of those sent out to everyone who's attended. I know I've had a couple of requests from people who were unable to attend as well. So I'll get a PDF of those sent out across to people. If anyone does need any kind of CPD certificate, again, you should have my contact details on the invitations and registration details that have been sent to you. So feel free to drop me an email and I'll get those across to you. I'll also make sure that Richard's contact details are highlighted in the email across to you as well, just so that if there's anything further that you want to contact Richard or Impart with, then you've got his details. So unless you've got anything else to add, Richard?
No, well, I obviously just hope people found it useful. And yes, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch.
Brilliant. And thank you very much. I've had a couple of comments. Thank you. Excellent. You're all very welcome. I hope you found it useful. We'll be back in touch with any future webinars and events that are taking place across Seeker. So keep an eye out. Thank you very much. Stay safe, everyone. Take care, and we will hopefully see you soon at our next webinar. Thank you very much for your great comments. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Bye.